And for the last 100 years, we keep trying new things to standardize. We create these standards organizations, and they're kind of dysfunctional. They don't work very well. Ultimately, they get something done, but frequently they're really slow, and what comes out the other side is often disappointing and takes too long. No. So there are lots of standards that are just like, people think that basically the web has two speeds. It's either really slow sometimes, like there's times when it seems like nothing new is happening, and then really fast where like you can't keep up because there's new things coming out all the time. But in fact, it only has one speed. It's like glacially slow. When things seem fast, it's only because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the pipeline coming out from a decade or more ago. So like we got Flexbox and Grid and like all these things, but like a lot of those conversations date back to like 2003 or even 1998, and there's still standards that we're working on in the late 90s that we don't have today. But for most people who just do development, like they can't, you can't spend 13 years of your life figuring out what might or might not happen, right? So there's been a lot of efforts in the past couple of years to change how standards work, to make them more efficient, and to engage more people who aren't typically like standards people. And so I'll let John, can you say something, John, just so I can make sure we can still hear you?
I can hear myself.
Okay.
But can you?
We can hear you, yes. So,
great.
How do you want me to handle this?
Do you have like, should we share a link or not share a link?
Yeah, there's a link. It's on Twitter.
Okay.
It's already on the internet.
Did you already?
There's no going back.
Okay. So, anyway, this is my friend John, and
Hi.
I'll let John introduce himself. And John, since we have the control of display, if you like need to direct us for anything, let us know.
Okay, I'd like a wide angle shot. It starts off, fades from black. Hi. Thank you so much for coming out and chatting with me about CSS, because it's really cool. You can decide how things look on a page, and that is neat. Brian, would you like me to talk about Cssdb?
Yes, John, I would.
Well, then if you could somehow like also put it on the screen, I can like talk us through it. So let me know when folks can see the page.
We have it on the split screen with you, right?
Well, fantastic. All right then. So you're looking at Cssdb. It's a list of a bunch of CSS features. They're features that, well, they're coming soon to a browser near you. Some of them are already there, but some of them you might not have heard about. So if you look, you can see that it's these list of items, and they've got a brief description of what this thing is that you could do in CSS, and then it's got a little example of like, how it would look. And, you can see some other stuff like who's already doing it and, how can you use it now. But the big thing you see is just a big number, and that is what we call a stage. I heard a little noise. Did you have a question?
No, it was some feedback.
Oh, okay. Feedback's fun. All right. So the idea of this page is like, it's super simple. It's that I am often not a very smart person, and I forget a lot of things. And if you're like me, sometimes you use services like Stack Overflow or like MDM or Can I Use, and you're like how do I do this thing? And like, will it actually work, right? Because you could like do a thing and it looks great on your computer, and then it like doesn't look good anywhere else. And so I really like those services. But there were like lots of things I wanted to use that weren't quite there yet, but some people were starting to use them, or they were talking about them, or like everybody really wanted them, but you didn't know like like, is it ready? Is it done? And so services like Can I Use are great for things that already exist, and I think they're getting better at things that are like coming along. And Stack Overflow is good for like stuff that's already been around, which is why, like, you know, it's like the typical like, how do I do this? And they're like, well, you install jQuery, and so I really wanted to know how we could do things in CSS natively or in JavaScript natively. That's why there's tools like Babel. Now, like, why? Why would you want to do things like natively? And it's because the path of least resistance is really nice. It's really nice when you have to when you don't have to think about how you're going to get something done, or when the solution's so easy that you can do it again and again, and you can change how you do it a little bit. And web standards are like that. They're like a V1.0 product that's done. Once you learn something, it's always going to keep working, and that's the great thing about the web. But when new stuff's coming, it's not always there yet. Back in the day, I remember when like border radius came out. Like, I could add a rounded edge to something. Me, like every other developer out there, I'm like, I have to add a rounded edge to everything now. And then you did, and it like you could pick, like it worked in, was it maybe Safari or Chrome, or it could like work in Firefox, because you'd learn like one prefix for the selector. You'd be like, Moz border radius, because it was like an experimental thing. It wasn't done yet. So these stages are basically telling you how ready it is. And the way they work is it starts off really simple, which is the idea of it. Like, we're writing down, hey, if you type this in a browser, it should do this. That's one half of the equation. That's like someone saying, John, are you done with your, how far along are you on your project? And you're like, well, I've got an idea of how I want to get it done, right? That's some work's being done. But there's a difference between that and like, I have written code, and here, look, see my code, it's done, right? So we divide it into kind of two groups, which is how far the idea is coming along, and then how many browsers have implemented it. Where is it actually working? And we put those together, and we come up with this number, because some people sat in a room at one point and said, the best way to remember if something's done is to use the numbers 0 through 4. 0 meaning like, it's really not done. We've just got like an idea of what's going on. And 4 being like, it's done. We're done here. So let me talk briefly about these stages. Like, there's a new feature coming to CSS. It's border radius, or it's nesting, or it's something. Somebody in the working group, and if you all haven't, you kind of heard Brian talk about what the working group is. It's just an organization. It's just people that are trying to get something done. Like Hydra is like one, and like there's other groups, right? Csswg is another one. Poor comparison, but so the Csswg, like what they want to get done is like they want you to be able to create great experiences in your browser through CSS. So they're working on that, and they're maintaining how browsers can do that consistently together. So somebody there has an idea, and they're like, it'd be really great if we could do nesting, which is like an idea we've like all wanted for like a million years. And so then they write it up. They're like, well, what if like we could do this thing? And we call that stage 0. It's like, if you scroll down to the stages section, it'll like say, what are the stages? And for like 0, it's like, I have this crazy idea. It's like being in the room with the Pixar people when they're like, an old man builds an airship and a young boy comes along and they go on an adventure, right? That doesn't tell you like what happens, the dialogue. It's just sort of this like idea. Stage 1 is when the other writers in the room go, you know what? We could actually make a movie about that. We should see, like, let's kick around that idea for a bit. Tell me more about the old man, right? And so that's stage 1. It's when the working group, not just someone in it, but the group has decided, let's see what happens with this idea. We don't know how it's going to happen. We don't know what happens in the adventure. We just know it'd be cool if there was an adventure. And so once stage 1 begins, that's when you start seeing the spec appear in like the CSSWG's like website. That's when you start seeing people talking about it on GitHub, like how's this going to work. And what we decided is that stage 2 is when they now know how it's going to work. Like, you're going to type in border radius, and it's going to do this thing. And we've written up all these scenarios of like how it's kind of going to work. It means they know how they're going to solve the problem. And that's stage 2. Stage 3 is some browser out there goes, oh, everybody's wanting to solve this problem. That's fantastic. Look, there's even a specification that tells us how to do it. Let's go ahead and we'll add it into the browser. Like, let's do it. We'll throw it behind a flag, though. And it works because it's behind a flag. But they're actually trying it. So, like, the 12 developers at Google and some of us on the internet that are geeks, we, like, turn on the flag and we're like, yeah, let's like, code and see what happens. And then we, like, start finding issues. Or we start saying, like, why does it work a little differently in this browser? Why does it work a little differently in there? This is that implementation phase where you're like, your idea wasn't perfect. Like, we never decided how the old man gets to South America. Like, this is a major problem. So in this stage 2, while it's really nebulous, it's the idea is that they're starting to think it through. And in stage 3, people are actually starting to do it. Stage 3 is when now the browsers are starting to implement it. Not everybody has it. The idea is not totally done, but like you can tell a story. And a lot of the stuff you use that's modern is that. It's like we've all agreed this is like a really cool idea and this is how we would do it. But it's not done. Stage 4 is when it's done. Like, we're not going to change this document anymore. We've worked out all the problems and it's done. So those are the stages. You could talk through all that like I did, but that's like a lot to like think about every time you want to do one thing. So wouldn't it be better if somebody just said, it's 0, like we're not there yet, or it's 3, this is like probably going to happen. So that's what Cssdb is. It's a list of a bunch of stuff that's going to be coming that you could write that could help you do your job so much better, but you don't know if you can use it yet. It's not a can I use, it's not does a browser support it, it's like how ready is this? Does it make any sense to anybody? Because if it doesn't, I'll start making a new website.
Hold on, we have a question, John.
So
okay, great.
Hey, so I see like here it says, you know, et cetera, used with a post CSS plugin.
Yeah.
What's that?
Okay. Oh man,
Finally.
that is a fantastic question because it's one of those segue questions to like, wow, thank you for asking.
I'm a planner.
Post CSS is a tool that takes in CSS and it can understand it in a way that like you can change it. Like in the same way that when you do query selector and you grab an element on a page, now you could like do things with that element. Post CSS is like that for CSS files. Now it doesn't do it in the browser. That's what we call Houdini, where you could change things while they're happening. But when you're just writing CSS, maybe you've used Sass. Sass is like that. It's like you're going to read in a document, you're going to do things to it, and then you're going to push something out, like a static, file. It's done. And so what these post CSS plugins are doing is they're using post CSS to read your file, and you wrote border radius. And then they're like, well, in some browsers that don't support this, you could write Moz and it would work. And so they actually see your rule, and then they copy it, and they write in the prefixed version. And there's a really popular tool that is wholly designed to just do this. It's called Auto-Prefixer. That is a post-CSS plugin. Post-CSS reads the file, Auto-Prefixer goes, oh, I see you were doing this and this and this. Let me replace it for you with stuff that's going to work in all browsers. You code what you meant. I'll make it understandable to everybody else.
So, so how familiar are you with like post processors or preprocessors? Not very much, or
Conceptually,
okay.
preprocessors, but not with those processors.
So it's a preprocessor. Like it depends on what you say pre and post, but it's a preprocessor.
It's a fun name. Yeah, it's just a fun name. It's like Babel for CSS.
Yeah.
Just reads the file, and then you do whatever you want with it.
Right. So, a lot of CSS features deal with effectively better ways to express something that you could theoretically already express today.
Right.
Right. So,
But I guess what I'm getting at is like, let's say let's say you've got a stage 2 or a stage 3 and it's this cool thing and, you know, it's 2001 and you're just figuring out how to do rounded edges, right? But you want to make sure that, you know, when your user, your customer, whoever it is looking at your site, that it's going to render correctly for them. So when you're talking about a plugin, is that something that would only be user dependent?
No.
Or is that something that you can like write in your HTML to say,
so
if the user doesn't have this, then
so if you think about how a tool like okay, so you familiar with like jQuery? No. Okay. No, it's okay. I'm looking for like something that is
I'm sorry,
relatable.
It's like a technical group. Justin,
That's
you can,
okay.
Like, get the boot out.
No, it's okay. No, I mean that's literally why we're here. So
You are super welcome here.
Oh, thank you.
so if you think about like when you send HTML or CSS or anything, what you're sending is a text file, right? Like, what then the browser has to like parse that and make meaning of it, right? So what a preprocessor does is the same thing. It has to read your text file and understand it somehow and translate it into some new output, which is now the text file that your browser will get instead of the one that you had before.
Okay, so that preprocessor sort of translates like the stage 1 or stage 2 idea into a stage 4 idea? Like it does that translation for you?
It does something a lot like that. It tries to find, in many cases, there's an equivalent. There was a harder way to write it that required a lot more thinking. And so mostly these features are things that like you could have done, and you're on a really great thing, which is that there are some features that CSS could never have done. Like this, you've heard about grids. It's a new way to lay things out. There was no way to do that before in any reasonable fashion. So there's not really a way to polyfill it. There's not a way. You'd have to know the page while it's happening, right? So I think you're onto something good here, which is that post CSS, like Sass, it's limited to that text file before anyone gets it.
Yeah.
It can try to move some things to stage 4. It can try to find the clever workaround, but it doesn't always.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like pre-processing tools. So like another thing a lot of people do is like minify their code. That is also like reading in your one text file and understanding it enough to spit out a different text file that is the one that your browsers will actually get. So it feels like there's like actually really a lot in CSS that post CSS couldn't do for you. But the idea of a plugin is that it is when it reads so you can think about it like it reads it in and it builds some kind of abstract tree structure in memory, like the DOM is for HTML, right? And in the work of processing that, in order to get to the output, you can register plugins. So there's an engine that's post CSS, and there are plugins, which is what does post CSS do? How does it transform? Does that make sense? Yeah. So auto prefixer is one plugin, and maybe John explain like what that plugin does.
Yeah, well, that plugin sees when you wrote something like full screen because you wanted to target styles for an element when it's full screen. And it knows that you can do it in other browsers with prefixes. So they'd call it WebKit full screen, Moz full screen, because the feature's not fully there yet. But it's stable enough now that by simply adding a prefix, it would have worked. By simply changing the code a little bit, it would have worked consistently in all those browsers. And that is the name of the game with auto prefixer. It's to just simply read a file, see what things it could add a prefix to, and add them. There's one wonderful gem inside of it, though, which is that you can say which browsers you are trying to have your CSS work in. You could say, I need Firefox the last 3 versions. And it'll go, you know what? When you wrote border radius, it's worked in Firefox the last 3 versions. We don't need to transform your code there. But, oh, I see you used full screen, and you're asking for a Safari version that didn't have it. Well, here, I'll give you the prefix there. I'll write it for you. You don't worry about that. You just tell me which browsers you intend to support. And if those browsers can support a prefix, Auto Prefixer will add it for you.
Yeah. It's like I was saying, if you go, can you go back to the Cssdb page?
Mhm.
So, John, is it the case that like most of these things that are stage 3, like have prefixed implementations, or?
It's a mixed bag. There's different ways you can try to polyfill something. CSS is a lot more limited than JavaScript. You can't polyfill things like you can in JavaScript, but there are clever, limited ways you can do things like custom properties. Custom properties, what really makes it great and different than Sass is not possible to do at build time. You can't possibly know the order of your DOM, for instance, right? Because CSS isn't the DOM, it's just styling that. So what you could do is say, hey, anywhere where you used a variable globally and then you had it in a selector, I'll support that. Like, I'll read your global variables and I'll replace your variables that you used later in the file, like presuming that they're going to match the global. That's a very limited form of variables. That's not their full power. But for somebody who's building something to be more backwards compatible, that's probably a better fallback. At least it's a fallback that in many cases is worth testing, so that your QA team can go, oh, it looks great in IE11 again.
So do you know?
Because custom properties were never there in IE.
So do you both know custom properties in CSS? It's not that, like, it's newish. Do you know custom properties?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is again one of those things that's like all the way back to the 1990s. There were things when they were trying to publish CSS 2.1. What very frequently happens is when you're writing a spec, you get a list of features that's like, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. But ultimately, you have to say, are we going to ship the spec or are we not going to ship the spec? And browsers are kind of constantly developing and prioritizing and changing their minds. And so what ends up happening is you frequently get a list, say, this big, and then they go, okay, well, these ones maybe next version, and we're going to focus on these ones. And then as we get a little closer, it gets a little bit smaller, and then we find this is what we're going to publish for absolutely sure. This is what has good support. This is what we're on track with. So there were things that people pointed out when they were working on CSS 2 in like 1998. The list was this big, and about like this much of the list we still don't have from then. And they were comments about things that would make it reasonable, like a language about styling should have this concept. And one of those things was some concept of like a variable, right? So you have all of your style sheets and you want to define like theme colors and, just really common set of things where you want to have located in one place some variables, right? And then just refer to them throughout your code. So this is easy to do with a preprocessor because you can just like token replace. You can just be like, anytime you see this thing, you replace it with this thing, and then no browser had to implement anything. But that meant that you needed a preprocessor to do variables at all. And any way you look at it, that is work that is probably better done one time rather than every time somebody loads your page doing like this token replacement in your CSS before you can even really begin to parse it. Like you don't want to have to download all the CSS and then do this token replacement because like your CSS is in your critical path. You need it before you start rendering. So the comment for well, like 15 years was kept trying it, but then somebody would always say, but that's just better done in a preprocessor. So we don't want it in CSS. There was a lot of pushback. And I guess maybe 2013 or 2014 finally struck on something that did seem to fit in CSS, which is custom properties. And custom properties is a way that you define a property, a custom one. Can you scroll to custom properties on here? It should. It's on here, right? Custom properties. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So remember, John was talking about prefixed things. So you used to have like dash moz dash height dash moz dash whatever, right? So CSS always had this forward compatible grammar that was dash some prefix dash property name, right? So struck on this idea that if you just drop off the vendor in that, you say dash no vendor dash, we can call that a custom property, and you can define it yourself like this. So this is saying create this new property called some length, set it to 32 pix. And then later, I mean, this is kind of silly because it's compressed, for example, but later somewhere else, you would pull the value out of that with the var function. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this. And what John is saying...
Brian.
Yeah?
I'm having some trouble hearing you, Brian.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Or?
The robots have taken over. I only hear digital Brian.
Okay.
Maybe just face the computer.
Okay. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this. But the interesting part about it is that there are legit CSS properties. And so they work just like every other property in CSS. Like they inherit, they're part of the cascade. So you don't swap tokens or anything like that. It's just another property that's in the CSS property set. And then the neat thing about it is you can, if you change a selector, it might change the resultant property of something. So what John is saying here is there's a subset of that, which is basically the same subset that you can do token replacement with. That if you limit your use of this to just being the root set some properties and then access them just as if there's nothing in between them, you can write code that would work in modern browsers and you make use of that feature. But you can also support older browsers because that does polyfill down to effectively, I'm just going to replace a bunch of tokens in your CSS. So, did I explain that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I heard probably a shorter version of it.
Okay, sorry.
Due to digital distortions. No, as long as you could, as long as everyone there heard it.
So John, are there people who do anything with post CSS to output JavaScript as well? To attempt to?
Yes. Yes. So there are attempts to bridge the gap between CSS that can be pre-processed and CSS that can be processed on the front end. One such example is Focus Within. Focus Within is so useful. Imagine you have like a div or a section tag or something, and inside of it you have a label for a form element and you have an input for it. And a lot of people, like, here's an example design. You have this input label that like sits over the input, right? It's like your name goes here, and when you click it, like the word shifts up, and now the input is like it's focused, and you can type stuff in. Well, you'd have to use a lot of JavaScript to pull that off. Normally, you'd be like, oh, okay, when the input gets focused, go ahead and like bubble that up to like the next parent element, and then give that a new class name, and then you'll style in your CSS your label to move up when that parent element has gotten the new class name. We're all good. Like that's a bit complicated. In CSS, I'd just like to write, when this element has focus somewhere inside of it, then find a label inside of it and change the way it looks. That's how that works. So it's really useful, but how would you know that in pre-pro? You wouldn't know before the page is ever loaded whether something's focused. So here's an example. There's a post CSS feature, Focus Within, and what it does is it copies your rule and gives it an attribute. It copies it to work the old way where you needed to use JavaScript. And then there's a complementary JavaScript plugin that says, hey, when someone focuses within, when it's not supported, go ahead and add this attribute to the page and bubble it up. So then the browsers that don't support focus within, they use the rule that got copied for you automatically, and the browsers that do support it get the rule that they wanted. They get the styles that they wanted. So it's like a future compatible way, a backwards compatible way as well, to like write your code. You can use focus within now, but the older browsers will use a combination of a certain strategy to accomplish it using JavaScript and CSS. So it's a bit tricky in the details, but it sure is nice just to write the CSS you intended and let the tools that you use kind of fix it for you.
Yeah.
So that's an example.
Could you scroll back to the stages? So this is something that like I'm not sure. Yeah, just try to get them all on the screen. Or that's good enough. This is one of the things that like I'm not sure is really entirely clear about this, and giving these things a label and trying to make them so that you can more easily follow like what's going on. One of the things that is part of the aim of changes in standards that I was talking about. So there's Babel, there's other efforts, Houdini, things like that. Part of the idea here is that standards do take a really long time. A lot of things need to happen to get it all the way to the finish line. Once we get there, if it's disappointing, we have to go back to the beginning, which is really, really painful. So part of the idea here is you can't afford to be involved for 13 years in something, right? But you can know that there's an experiment. And if there's an easy way for you to try that experiment, to do something useful, maybe something you can ship into production, because it just like it just desugars the thing that you really want to write into the thing that you would have had to write anyway, and at least does so with the same consistent formula that other sites use, like that it's well tested. And then the nice thing about that is that you can get some of the value of like being able to write it that way, but also like you can provide feedback into the standards process. Like you can ask questions about how this works.
Mm-hmm.
Like when it's just hardly an idea, right? Like when it's still very, very malleable and we're not deeply, deeply invested in it. Because the problem with like even when your company gets really deeply invested, like it starts to get like we can't change this now.
Fossilized.
Yeah, we can't change this now, right?
Yep.
And on the web, it's actually really, really easy to create something that we can't back out of. But if we're taking things that systems and browsers can do and making it just possible for you to use them, the idea is to correct the imbalance and like give you value that's not today standards value, but like let you try them so that you can find out. Because a lot of times what you find is that like maybe it's not as good as you read, right? Maybe as you start to use it, you have new ideas about new use cases. So like
Yeah, actually,
go ahead.
that's something I would like to sort of talk about for a moment, which is we described a lot of things that are going on in this page. We described like what a feature is, but remember the idea of knowing how far it is done is because if you go to implement it and you find problems and you see that it's this really early feature, one, you knew that feature was not ready yet. So you had the power to choose to use something that might change. And two, because it might change, as you use it, if you discover a better way to do it, there's still time for you to let people know, and you can improve the idea.
Yeah. Yep. I think a really good example of this is I had a similar project, different but similar, and I was in a similar situation where there were all these great seeming things that were written down in 1998 that I thought if I just had those, my life would be so much easier, right? I wouldn't have to be having all these conversations with all these other people, because if I could just, for example, select the elements that I want with a good selector, this would, like this whole, everything would just, I would be able to take vacations again because I wouldn't spend all this extra time doing that. And one of the things that I was really, really interested in was local links, which is a CSS selector that would allow you to style links differently, like based on some qualities about the URL, basically. And I thought a number of times that I needed that. And, oh, look, this example and this example and this example and this example, they would have been so easy, but they turned out to be like so hard because we don't have that. So in my similar system, I wrote that. Like I implemented what I thought, how I thought it worked. And then I also wrote web platform tests. And I sent it to the author, and I said, just make sure that I got this right. It should be like no-brainer, but just check it out. And I think this is a good way that we can, like John's thing, we could write web platform tests against John's implementation, and then we can say, did John's implementation get it right? And if like the editor can say yes, then before any browsers go to implement, we already have some tests, which is like super great. So I sent it to the editor, and the editor said, that's not how that works at all. And it turns out that, like, as he explained to me and I corrected my implementation, I realized, please don't waste time on that. That's not going to help me at all, right? Like, that's a terrible feature. I don't even want it. Like, I want this other thing instead. So it like just changed the whole conversation. But I imagine that if I had waited to the end of that 15-year cycle and we had finally gotten that, and only then did I get to realize, wow, this is not so good, actually. That would feel considerably worse than like realizing that it wasn't the feature that we wanted and having those conversations earlier, you know. So, do you all know how to comment on standards and things like that? Like, do you know? No.
That
So all
is
you
a
need to do-
conversation in its own, right?
All you need to do is open a bug on cssdb.org, and John will take care of the rest. No, I'll put some links in the meetup thing, but there are like several forums that are like easier or harder. But if you tweet at the browsers themselves, actually, you can report bugs that way. Definitely, they listen. Yeah. I think there's another effort that we started as well called WICG. That's for really early things. That's the Web Incubator Community Group. And
Oh, the I stands for incubator now? That's cool.
now what?
I thought it was. I was thinking of RIC, the Responsive Images Community Group.
No. It's Web Incubator
No.
Community Group.
Oh, cool. Much better acronym.
So, yeah, so that uses discourse, and you can subscribe to individual topics. You can go look, and if you have an idea, you can share it. If you want to comment on other people's ideas, or just heart them, or star them, or whatever you do. All of the
You can heart
all of the
and
working
star.
groups have people who watch them and carry that feedback forward. Or you can come to one of their chapters, preferably one not on a Memorial Day weekend, where there will be more people. Anybody have anything else? It's warm in here, is it not?
It's a little warm.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question that might not be related to this, but, you know, how do the browsers, so for example, if you scroll on this page, I see you've got little icons representing the different browsers, and then there's numbers associated with that. So
Yes.
that's just a practical thing, you know, what do the numbers mean? But I'm curious, like, how do the web browsers decide to adhere to which standards? So what, you know, we've got a lot of variation in those numbers, and as somebody who's built websites, especially in the early days, it was a nightmare, and you know, you still get sites that don't really perform in this browser, but they work in that browser. And so how does that happen? And
You want to
and
answer,
feel
John?
free
That
to
is-
answer like a very
Oh man, Brian knows this better than anybody, so I want to give my less good answer first, and then let Brian
Go for it,
expand
yeah.
upon it. The browsers, I refer to them often as the implementers, which are the people that will add the feature into the browser. They have different interests. They have different things they're trying to accomplish. So Microsoft was a great innovator of ideas because they had a web browser and an operating system. And so they were like, we'd like to be able to have a web page that loaded and then loaded something else from another page. And they came up with the XML HTTP request. Now we just have fetch. But what would happen is they would just add it into the browser. They wouldn't necessarily write documentation as a standard. They wouldn't reach out to Mozilla and say, hey, what if we add this thing in? And so there was the browser war era where browsers would just come up with features based on their own interests or things that they think would be helpful for their users. And, you know, like tabs in browsers was one that, you know, Firefox was just owning, and right, Internet Explorer's like, we don't need tabs. And then they saw how great it was, and they're like, all right, well, tabs are pretty cool now. That still kind of happens with ideas. Here's an example. If y'all can see my iPhone, the new iPhone, you know, not new anymore, but it came out, and they're like, we've got a notch. That's right. Part of the screen is no longer visible. And then when they were testing it, they were like, so pages don't always look good when you cover up the top of them. And so then somebody's like, all right, we'll add in this thing where like based on, you know, how you have your phone angled,
Somebody
we'll
at
like
Apple.
have a property. Are you still, what?
Somebody at Apple.
Yeah, somebody at Apple's like, so we'll just go ahead and like, we'll have like a special variable. But they're like, we can't use variables because we want to have like a media query that does it. And they're like, all right, we've got a new thing. It's called const. And it means it's like a constant variable, right? They were basing it off of the previous art. And they're like, all right, but they can't just go tell everybody. They can't tell everybody, hey, new iPhone's coming out. It's got a notch. So we're going to need some new CSS. So what they did is they tried to ask some questions probably like, hey, would it be cool if we had variables that worked in media queries? But there wasn't interest from everybody else. Not everybody else was adding a notch to their phones. And so what happened was they actually shipped a feature before there was a specification. So when you ask, you know, hey, how do the features all agree with each other? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have a feature because they really need it for a product, and they don't necessarily have a specification yet. Other times, one adds it and the other browsers go, that's not really our audience. Firefox has this great feature called logical properties where you can style things once and they change how the style is affected based on whether you're reading things left to right or right to left. So Israeli Arabic countries could see things looking the way you intended without you having to write style sheets for US pages and style sheets for Arabic pages. So it's really great. There's these new features, but not the other browsers go, well, there's just not a lot of interest. There's not a lot of people trying to build international pages. And so if there's not a lot of interest, they don't copy each other. But I'll tell you, if someone adds a feature and people are like tweet storming it, like, oh man, this is the best feature. I can't wait till I can use this everywhere. All the browsers are like, oh yeah, Edge just got this feature. Right? They all start competing, and that's a really great thing. So they started innovating, coming up with new ideas, and copying each other. The standards organizations are there to make it consistent. So it's a push-pull between the vendors, the spec writers, and us who are trying to get stuff done.
Thank you.
Standards are phenomenally complex and
Yeah.
wildly strange ideas.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's like 100-year history of different, like trying different ways to achieve standards. So, like John is saying, there's a standards organization. You, like, if you want to be involved in the standards organization, you have to pay money to be involved in the standards organization. So,
Is it just money, Brian? If I just like saved up enough money, could I join, or do I also have to work for probably a browser?
You absolutely could.
Probably.
You absolutely could join if you had just money. You have to be a legal entity, which is like a thing I'll
Like
complain about another time.
corporation.
Like an
I'm
LLC.
legal.
Yeah, like an LLC.
Look.
Yeah. Or something.
Yeah.
I'm over 18. I can join.
So you have to be a legal entity to join, for example, W3C, which is itself not a legal entity and actually takes no money. You actually don't pay W3C to join. You pay a host organization like MIT. This is very complicated, weird stuff. So you have to pay money, and then like part of that is you get the ability to name people to working groups. So if you were just joining yourself, I would guess the reason would be so that you could nominate yourself to a working group, which happens. Like there are one-person organizations that pay the money or nominate themselves to a working group, and then they're on a working group. In that,
Who do I write the check to?
well, it depends which organization you want. There's like, right? Like, do you want IETF or what WGE? What WGE doesn't cost any money, so you don't have to. W3C, yeah. And so yeah, so pick your poison.
I'll take CSSWG for 200.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll have to join W3C.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. So, like if you're
I've tried
if you're
that. It
serious
didn't
about
work.
that, if you're serious about that, like you want to legit join W3C so that you can do that.
Oh, like I tried. Yeah, there's like a whole link
but
in the
there's
wiki
no-
of like.
there's no
So here's
try,
how you
like-
can try to do this. It's in the contributing file. Like if
Yeah.
you can figure this out, please share with the rest of the class.
We'll like ping me another night and we'll talk about it because like
Sure.
literally you can fill out paperwork and send a check and you are on the working group. I mean, you'll become your own advisory committee representative and then you'll have to name yourself to the working group and all that stuff. But if you do that, you also get like votes on formal matters, which is like your vote then is exactly the same as all of Google and all of Microsoft and all of Apple. Like you have exactly the same say, which is bizarre. But to say that you have exactly the same say is also to say about the things that we're writing on paper. It doesn't mean anything. There are like 1,000 specs of the W3C that like a great number of them will never be implemented by anyone, right?
So you're saying there's a chance.
Saying there's a chance. So imagine that we all like got together a group of people and we're going to make the standard for Pittsburgh something, right? And we're like, okay, so we're going to do this and we think that there's some advantage. So we're all going to put $100 a year into this pot and we're going to then make a trip here once a week and meet up and go through meetings and work out the details and write down these very detailed things that like we hope that will get implemented. So maybe 4 out of 20 of us actually are the ones who do the implementing. We're also paying to be in the room. But if I'm one of those people, you can't make me win anything, right? You might be really interested in one feature and you're really interested in another feature and I'm the one who controls the code. So like ultimately what ends up in my code is up to me, right? It's like it is in some ways like an altruistic act for a browser to like work, for them to work together, you know? And they all have their own different organizations with their own different priorities. And so maybe if you have a browser who doesn't like even have a mobile product, they're less concerned about things that are about mobile than somebody who does. Or maybe if you're the only one who makes a phone that has a notch in it, you're really concerned about that. And so you just write a proposal and you implement it and you release the phone and you say, look at this new thing, and you say, and here's the spec. So, yeah.
Wow. So for those of us that took history class and remember some things, it's like that moment where the guy said like, John Marshall has made his decision. Let us see him enforce it. Like you could write a spec, but like if the browsers are like, stop trying to make fetch happen.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's tough. But again, that's why you try to have a good relationship.
Right.
And that's why these feedback loops are important, because if developers can help and incentivize, then more quickly and with a better outcome, we can develop ideas that will help all of us get our own jobs done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's like really fascinating history of like standards organizations and like, for example, things that were held back by standards organizations because some of the members, I mean, it's sort of like a cartel, right? Like, I mean, some of the members went like, well, we agree that thing is better, but we just spent like $6 billion on the last thing. And if we standardize that, we now put ourselves at a disadvantage. So all of these new companies who are part of the group suddenly have this huge economic advantage, and we have this penalty because we can't afford. So we'll sign your contract, we'll endorse the spec, but only in a decade,
Yeah.
right?
Well, we like Betamax and VHS.
So Betamax and VHS is like actually just competition between two things, but more like open source, right? Yeah. But I use that example a lot though, in like markets like to pick winners, right? I mean, like it's not like that's a probably silly capitalist sort of extrapolation, but like even in nature, right? Like there's like push and pull of evolution that will, like, if you have these two things that are competing, they will either enter some kind of balance or one of them will become the dominant species, right? So VHS and Betamax is a really good example, and it's actually my favorite example that I talk about, like that standards never pick winners, right? Like we never, like, we talk about how things aren't good, but we also pretend that there's some quality of good that really matters. So Betamax is a great example because it is technically way superior. It's like it's not an opinion, like it's a fact. Betamax is technically superior to VHS, and yet VHS was the one that mattered because, like, nobody carried Betamax because some obscure things like the price point, right? Like the price point was initially higher, different contracts, different marketing. VHS won.
Mm-hmm.
Like, quality had very little to do with it. What mattered was, is it good enough? Like, does it pass the fitness function? And like, we like to pretend that we know what the fitness function is and that it should have something to do with quality, but like, it's not. It's definitely not the biggest indicator. Like, the best thing almost never is the thing. Yeah.
Yes. But if more of us work together, it's better.
Absolutely.
And that's what's
Yeah.
beginning to happen. There's a coalescence occurring where more dialogue is occurring between the implementer and the user and the developer.
Yeah.
And as that feedback loop gets better, we want to inspire folks like you to know a little bit more about it so that eventually there's this larger body of consensus that can help test ideas, talk about ideas, contribute back.
Yeah.
So if it's a few people in a room, they're more prone to make mistakes when trying to implement something that affects billions of people.
Well, and it's just, a lot of it is just guesswork, right? That's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Like a really lot of standards conversation is talking about what you all will think, right? They call it bike shedding. Like, it's the bike shed thing? Like, so it comes from like a group that was discussing like a nuclear facility or something, and like most of the stuff was just kind of like dry, boring, over everyone's head, and meetings were really quiet until they began discussing, like, well, we want employees to be able to like bike to work, so we want to put a bike shed in. And then like everybody was very vocal about that because it's super easy to have an opinion, right? Like, you don't have to know anything about anything. You can debate all kinds of things about that, so like, whether you will like it, what you will use it for, like, will it be confusing? If you have this, do you need then these other things? Like, those are things that without data, it's just very easy to have opinions, and like, there's no way to prove right or wrong. So like, if you had a committee trying to pick what will be the standard, Betamax or VHS, they would have probably picked Betamax, right? But the rest of the world picked VHS, and I think it was pretty good that we all had one, right? Like we all had VHS. Like it's definitely more important for us all to agree. So the earlier we can get that, like get that agreement, get things to regular developers, the less of that kind of talk needs to happen in those rooms about speculation. What will you think? What will you do with it? What, like, will you like it? Will you not like it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There, we've solved CSS. Good job, everyone.
Yeah. So, John, what's the best thing in Cssdb? Like, what's the one
What's the best thing?
Yeah, like, what's the one?
Oh.
Like, if you had to pick one feature, you're like, just here's a reason for you to try.
Custom variable. You're talking about like something that's like not yet done, like something really early.
I'm saying like something that is pretty early that you're like, this is really good, and I think if somebody wasn't using Post CSS today, this would be a good thing for them to try because it's valuable to, like.
Yeah, it depends on the person. I mean, it depends on the project. While they can be abused, I think nesting is. I even hear from a lot of developers I look up to that if they could just write a selector and then say, I already have that selector, just when I'm already in there and I want to target this now, that's what we call nesting. It's like you nest your selectors, you don't have to rewrite it. They'd say like that would be easier. Another example of like a kind of nesting is like, I already wrote my selector and now I want to target the media query. I don't want to have to write the media query and then rewrite the selector. I want to do it the other way. So I'm repeating myself less. And so that when I visually look at it, I understand like the media queries affecting this other thing I already wrote. So like that idea of nesting, I think would be probably the lowest hanging like sugar that developers would really like. Because when they're writing code, it just means less repetition and better visual formatting of their code.
Yeah.
That's probably the most popular one by like a huge margin.
I don't know if you can hear me.
I'll repeat it if you can. That's fine.
Okay. So I'm wondering what the nesting rules actually do functionally, which also makes me think, I don't know, maybe there could also be a longer description or something. But so is that just saying for all the key elements within article elements, give them this content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is a limitation of the database, which is that I'm just describing it very vaguely. And this list is by no means perfect. There were other questions that people have been asking about. You know, how could we better refine like what you're talking about specifically? Brian talked earlier about how specs can say a lot of things, and it's like, oh, I only want to know about this subset of things in the specification. The second thing is, nesting is stage 0. Like, it's hard to describe it because you don't yet know how it's going to end up being. We think it's going to be like this, but if you were to look at the latest GitHub issue, which I filed like this last week, saying, could you please just decide if you're going to like move forward with this idea or not? People started saying, yeah, I'd love nesting rules, and I want them to scope new things, like these new ideas. So at a high level, nesting's kind of like Sass nesting. It's like the idea that you say, when I use this character, I mean to continue another rule like before. I mean to say something more about my rule. But it's not described really clearly, and it's not known how it's going to work. So I would expect a lot of those stage 0 things, they're going to feel a lot more nebulous.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
So I think pretty much now this would do like basically like Sass or less similar, right? Like it would effectively,
Yes.
in your example, it would rewrite this to article space P braces color
Precisely.
333.
Yeah.
But the advantage
Yeah.
is like if you have article and inside article you have an H, you have a P, you have a section, you don't have to keep repeating article. Right.
It's like you're aware of your context.
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't need to repeat my context anymore. You know what a similar in ways a similar selector is matches, right? Where if we all scroll up to matches, it's a stage 2 feature. Let me refresh my page and find it up here. So matches basically says when I'm in a selector and I want to grab these items. What's really cool is that this is a really desired feature and it's stage 2, so you're like, wow, this is like pretty stable. Chrome implemented it differently than Firefox, right? And Firefox or Safari got it right, I think. It was like they all like had different ways they thought this worked. So, like we look at it and we go, okay, if you're scrolling up there, you're like, okay, a paragraph that is also the first child or is special, right? We kind of get that. But then someone was like, okay, I want a paragraph, and then instead of like immediately matches, like I want a sibling selector that's dot special. Or it's a sibling selector that's like, you could write P space and then like colon matches and then say like body and then special. And it's like, wait, body's not happening within a paragraph tag, but the way it's actually supposed to work is it's like, does the selector match? In other words, it's something that is a sibling of a paragraph that is also a body with a descendant of special. It's like you're taking two selectors and you're trying to match them together. They call that like the intersection of two selectors. Whereas Chrome was just like, it's kind of like you're just repeating the first part.
Mozilla,
right?
Mozilla also has an implementation of this. I think it's -moz any.
Yeah, and I don't know whether theirs is an intersection or simply like, can you put in a selector that references a parent of the thing before matches? Can you have an intersection of these selectors? And that's something that the polyfill as well as Chrome, I think, got unfortunately wrong. And so that polyfill is going to need to be updated. And there might be scenarios it can't target, but it'll or just have a lot of selectors to try to figure out every possible permutation of how this would actually work. But that's why it's only stage 2. The how it's going to be done is known, but until we have implementations, we can't update the grammar. We can't update the specification to be like, listen, it's not a concatenation, right? Perhaps the spec could have been a little clearer, and then Chrome might have not written it incorrectly.
Yeah, on that one specifically, there was like a lot of discussion and debate on a number of things. These matches in any, like, they're used in UA style sheets actually.
Yeah, and any is like something you couldn't really polyfill. It's like saying like, doesn't it mean like, I want to style this and I don't want any selector weight. Like I don't want this to be more important than any other rule. I'm just saying, does it also match this?
No,
But,
it's
like-
basically like a logic forking thing. So like if you wanted to say like a P space.
Oh,
that's
I'm thinking
ending
of
up-
something, the something selector.
So it's used for headings a lot, right? So you have like moz any H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6,
Yeah,
and then section followed by any of those things. So that saves you.
Mhm.
It literally just saves you having to repeat like section H1, comma section H2, comma section H3, comma section H4.
right. Yeah, I was thinking of the something selector, which is like,
Yeah.
I just want to style this, but please don't make my CSS any more complicated than it already is.
That's a pretty neat idea. It's called it's not really called something, but it's basically, you know how specificity works in CSS? Like you have a rule set and then the rules are sorted by their specificity, which is just like how complex their, like what their selectors are made of, right?
I've noticed that, but just by accident, yeah.
So a lot of times you like don't want that at all, right? Like if you're making a component that you want it to reuse all over the place, you want it to have like basically no specificity. It's just like that's the base, right? So you want that to be like all the way toward the beginning, not have any weight, so that it's really easy for things to override them, right? So that was actually a thing that was actually Leah Viru that proposed that, I think. And nobody could determine like what would you call it? Like so it's a pseudo class, and it has, it's colon something parens, and then you put the selector in there, and then it won't have any specificity. It'll just be 0 or maybe 1.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to kind of like, I'd like to kind of wrap things up because we're geeking out on like specific ideas. So I just want to kind of wrap up my side, and you all can like chat. If you have questions, you can Twitter me and stuff, because I am like getting a little tired. But the idea is, it's hard to keep track of this. If you've gathered anything from what Brian and I have talked about, it's complicated. So from a high level, it's nice if you can kind of see generally where it's at. It's not there yet, it's 0. It's pretty close, it's 3. All right, these are ways for you not to have to think too much about it. And all those browsers that say what they're doing, most of that is coming from Can I Use. So we're actually seeing like, okay, these browsers support this feature. And then what PostCSS is doing is it's polyfilling some of those features so that you can say, I support these browsers, and then I want to write my code once this way.
Yeah.
And it will write it back. Finally, the advantage to using this, yes, we can help contribute to the standards organizations, we can help develop the feature, but we can also program more responsibly. We can say, hey, I'm going to use a bunch of stage 3 and 4 features, and then I also want to support older browsers. So it just helps us get our work done. Auto prefixers, just a really fantastic tool to be able to write your code once and not have to worry about all of these complications.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like probably the most critical aspect of this is like, here's an easy stream of where you could be like, oh, I can see what new things there are. You don't need to read 10,000 pages of specs and then like all these reports and everything. You can just get a high-level view and you can go, oh, that one is kind of interesting, and actually I have a use case that I think would be helpful. How would I do that, John? Well, there's how you do it. And so you can can very simply kind of keep a pulse on what's happening. Not everything, but a good amount. You can scan them, you can look for places where they bring you potential value, try them out, and then like I would hope if you do try them out, you let us know how it goes, right? Like, because that's really valuable.
I have one hot opinion on this, one controversial opinion, which is, even if the ideas aren't done, and if the idea doesn't already exist in another way that you're already using, like if you don't already have a SaaS solution that you're crazy about, you're gonna pick someone's sugar, right? You're gonna download some library, or you're gonna write it out really long and complicated. Try this way, because even if it changes, you're closer to the concept. Like they say, like you're closer to the metal. And there's a higher likelihood, if you're just a betting person, you've got this higher chance that you're getting closer to what's going to work in a year. When you revisit this code, it's going to make sense. Yep. That's why I would bet on even some of these lower stage items, because I'm just getting closer to that idea that could work everywhere and has been thought through more clearly than just anybody's idea.
Yep. Cool. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
You too. Bye.